So yeah, today I'll be talking about computer security incident response teams, or these are also sometimes called computer emergency response teams, or CERTs. So there's hundreds of CERTs around the world. They try not only to prevent security breaches, but also to repair the damage after an attack. That's often their focus is on the response rather than the prevention. So the map I'm showing here is current as of this morning. I updated the numbers. And it shows members of the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, or FIRST, which currently has 539 members in 96 different countries. There are actually many more incident response teams than what is shown on this map, because not all incident response teams are members of FIRST. But this map still gives you some sense of the distribution. The majority, or the largest fraction of teams, comes from the United States. It's not the majority. But it's a largest fraction from any country, followed by Japan and then Germany. So part of what's interesting about this organization is that it expands, or it spans multiple countries. So for example, teams from China and Russia, as well as the United States, even though these countries' governments are often trying to conduct espionage over the internet or otherwise attack each other. But these teams are still trying to have a cooperative relationship, and the primary goal of FIRST, this forum, is to encourage this kind of cooperation. So it leads to some interesting questions around when and how these teams cooperate. So what I'm going to talk about today is how these teams have attempted to build a global infrastructure to coordinate their operation. And it's going to be primarily historical. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the 1990s.
Can I ask a quick question?
What we mean by infrastructure. The image that I'm showing here comes from the January 1994 cover of Popular Mechanics. It shows how one artist imagined the information superhighway, or that's what the internet was called at the time. And they imagined it as something like a highway system, but using fiber optic cables, carrying different kinds of information. And the internet and highways, we can just understand as different examples of different kinds of infrastructures. And there's a large body of work on infrastructure, which I imagine some people on this call know about. Generally, it can be defined in terms of the intertwined technologies, organizations, and policies that enable information and goods to flow across space and time. There's an emphasis on flow, the ability to move easily across these spaces. And when infrastructure is working well, we generally don't notice it. It's only when it breaks down that we start to notice that we're not getting cell phone calls, or our internet's out, or the road's blocked. So in general, though, keeping an infrastructure working well requires a kind of invisible work. And some of that's depicted in this image as well, as you can see, these construction workers. But we generally don't think about them, and sociologists try to do sometimes what's called an infrastructural inversion, where they bring that work to the surface and make it more visible. So when we're talking about computer security incident response teams, they really have two different relationships to infrastructure. One is that they are developing infrastructure because they're trying to develop infrastructure to communicate and coordinate with one another. But their ultimate goal is to maintain a different infrastructure, whatever computer systems that they're charged with trying to protect or respond to when there's an incident. So they've also tried to develop this global infrastructure, though, to help them with the work of maintenance. So they're developing one global infrastructure in order to maintain another global infrastructure. And this brings me to the tension I want to explore today. So science and technology studies scholars, which is the field I'm working in, have treated infrastructure as something that tends to grow in scale and scope, and maintenance is something that is generally very local. So infrastructure has been understood as global in the sense that, as I mentioned a minute ago, it can be understood in terms of entwined technologies, organizations, and policies that enable information and goods to flow across space and time. So this is emphasis on flow and the extending or mobilizing nature of infrastructure. And by contrast, in most history of technology, maintenance is seen as something that is much more local. So David Edgerton in The Shock of the Old, he notes that maintenance and repair has been, quote, the realm of the small trader and skilled workers, something different from, marginal to, and yet interdependent with the great systems of techniques. And one of the things that comes out in the literature on maintenance and repair is that there's a lot of geographic specificities. So, for example, the repair economy in many parts of Africa are very different than they are in the United States. People are going to keep things running until the wheels fall off, and have all kinds of specialized shops that can try to repair things that in the US we probably just throw out. And that's just an example of how, depending on where you are in the world, there's a different economy and sort of system of repair in place. And it's generally conceived as something very local. Okay, so this tension between sort of a global infrastructure and local maintenance is part of what got me interested in this topic. When people started talking about having a global infrastructure for purposes of maintenance. And it's that tension that I want to explore. So the argument of the paper, which I think, I hope that a link went around, maybe some of you read the paper, but the argument that the paper makes, and that I'll just reiterate today, is that while incident responders tried to develop an infrastructure that was truly global, that transcended geopolitical boundaries, in practice that infrastructure was somewhat fragmented. And I also want to argue that despite what we might assume, this is not because maintenance is intrinsically local. In fact, some kinds of incident response infrastructure did become global. And I'm thinking in particular of things like public key encryption systems and having public keys readily available. That is a kind of infrastructure which became very global. But the infrastructure that the incident responders were really focused on developing was fragmented instead by reliance on local and regional trust networks, which in turn tended to be shaped by regional institutions and needs. So that's the main argument that I'm making today, and that is made in the paper that may have gone around. So to show what's at stake in incident response infrastructure and why trust really matters, it's helpful to go back to the very first incident that sparked the development of computer emergency response teams as a kind of organizational form. So on November 2nd, 1988, the internet, which at that time was primarily a research and education network sponsored by the US Defense Department, experienced what one computer scientist called an attack from within. So the Morris worm, as it's been called, because the son, the person who wrote it was a graduate student, also happened to be the son of a prominent computer scientist with the National Security Agency, a little embarrassing. He accidentally shut down much of the internet. It was not his intention to have this effect. So the worm exploited not only flaws in a complex system, but it also exploited the trust that was built into the network. So for example, there were trusted host-user relationships that didn't require passwords, and the worm exploited that to find and steal passwords and get into systems. So over the next 2 days, computer scientists worked around the clock to stop the worm. They sent email or called one another. They occasionally wondered, is this software really a patch? Is it a virus? How do I know I'm really talking with MIT? Despite all of those uneasiness, all that uneasiness that was going around, interpersonal relationships ultimately triumphed over the breach of trust. The people who were maintaining the internet at that time tended to know each other really well. So as one put it afterwards when they were discussing what had happened and revisiting it, the old boy network worked. And it was mostly boys at the time, not all, but mostly. Computer scientists recognized that despite the fact that this had worked once and that they'd managed to recover, this might happen again. So in anticipation of the potential for future attacks, they proposed establishing a non-governmental organization, the Computer Emergency Response Team Coordinating Center, or CERT-CC, which was housed at Carnegie Mellon University in its Software Engineering Institute. And trust was an explicit part of the CERT mission. So CERT was to provide a trusted 24-hour point of contact for emergencies. They needed trust in order to identify and correct vulnerabilities in computer systems and to adjudicate decisions about vulnerability disclosure. Obviously, you don't want to disclose a vulnerability to somebody who might exploit it. So they had to develop the relationships with the right organizations to manage that. And finally, they needed trust to help form and coordinate a network of CERTs, because nobody ever expected that the CERT Coordinating Center was going to handle all the attacks. The idea was that other CERTs would form and that the Coordinating Center would just help them. Okay, so this coordination effort, the effort to try to develop more computer emergency emergency response teams and coordinate them, that eventually became the Forum for Incident Response and Security Teams, or FIRST. And here I'm going to show most of the members were initially US governmental teams. The CERT Coordinating Center in Pittsburgh recognized the need for international coordination, and so they were actively trying to help teams around the world get started. And they had a vested interest in this. I mean, some of it was altruistic, but some of it was a vested interest because attacks were being launched on their networks from the Netherlands or from Australia, other parts of the world, and they wanted to know, who do we call when that attack comes through? Who do we ask to intervene over there? Okay, so they helped a number of teams around the world get started, and that's part of how it grew internationally. Okay, so these two charts give you some sense of the growing internationalization of FIRST between the end of 1996 and the end of 2010. The number of CSIRTs grew in all nations, but the United States became much less dominant. It still is the largest single player in the field, but there's a lot of other countries also involved. I should also note that while all teams list a primary country, and that's what I'm representing in these charts, many belong to multinational corporations which operate in multiple countries around the world. So none of these teams are really confined to just one country. Okay. So additionally, although FIRST was initially entirely governmental, commercial teams became much more common in the mid-1990s. And by 1997, about 40% of the CSIRTs that were within FIRST, this international organization, were commercial organizations. And these charts here show that that percentage continued to grow. And these changes in the incident response community were tied to the rapid internationalization and commercialization of the internet in the mid-1990s. So as more companies went online, a lot of them formed their own CERTs in order to manage potential incidents. So it was in this context of a rapidly expanding organizational field that two leaders in the field argued that, quote, a global response infrastructure was needed to, quote, replace a less reliable system based on trust between individuals with a reliable and effective system based on global understanding and agreement, end quote. And they cited the response to the Melissa virus, which struck the internet on March 26, 1999, and spread worldwide faster than any previous virus to date at that point, as evidence of the need for improved coordination. So, for example, the response to Melissa demonstrated a nascent infrastructure, but it was one that was largely centered on the CERT Coordinating Center in the United States, which received calls from all over the world, from Netherlands, Sweden, Singapore, the UK, Qatar, New Zealand, Canada. And many CSIRTs posted the CERT Coordinating Center advisory from the United States, CERT, on Melissa to their own organizations that they were trying to support. But according to the two leaders who wrote this report in 1999, quote, most of the global map was blank. And although the CERT Coordinating Center continued to be treated as an authority and to help coordinate incident response worldwide, its coordination was inadequate to meet the regional needs of many teams. So, for example, time zone differences meant that the coordinating center in Pittsburgh wouldn't respond as quickly when it was late at night in the United States, but still in the workday in Europe or Asia. It was a 24/7 center, but a lot of times what that meant was somebody took a message at 3 a.m. and they didn't really get to working on it until the next morning. So there was a need for better coordination in other parts of the world as well. And over the next decade, incident responders worked to develop several types of infrastructure. So in the interest of brevity, I'm just going to discuss a few of these efforts. There's much more in the paper. We can talk about them after the presentation as well, if that would be of interest to people. Yeah, just to reiterate, the coordinating center in Pittsburgh can't necessarily meet all of these regionally specific needs. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is EuroCERT, which was a basic incident response service for all of Europe that ran from 1997 to 1999. It was initiated by European teams in 1995 with the aim of maintaining contact information for teams, sort of a directory, and channeling information to appropriate teams when incidents crossed international borders. So importantly, the European Research and Education Networking Organization, TERINA, funded it. So this infrastructure, such as it was itself being built on top of a local networking organization with the support of this regional networking organization. Teams disagreed, however, on what Eurocert should be doing. So some thought that Eurocert was just a message coordinator. Others expected more active incident response work. And the result of that was that Eurocert ended very abruptly in mid-September 1999. And about a week after it ended, that the person in charge took a job at Cisco, and that was the end of it, pretty much. So about a week after it ended, several members of the teams that were involved with this met in Amsterdam to discuss other ways of working together. And they agreed that they would abandon the idea of a European-wide incident response service because they had disparate needs. But with, again, the support of Turina, this regional organization, they formed Task Force CSIRT, or TFCSIRT. And also with the support of Turina, they established a credentialing service known as the Trusted Introducer, which was to enable, quote, a trusted relationship between new certs and the established cert network. So the Trusted Introducer was effectively a vetting service that would make sure that any new CSIRT or CERT was doing things according to sort of basic best practices before allowing them into the club where they could get sort of common information that they would all share. Okay, so in Europe, there was a similar development. Like the European incident response teams, incident responders in Asia felt the need for a regional infrastructure. And several leading incident response teams, they began coordinating in the late 1990s. In 2003, they established the Asia Pacific CERT, or AP CERT, which initially included 15 teams across 12 economies. And like the European Coordinating Group, the AP CERT was supported by regional organizations like the Asia Pacific Networking Group and the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, APEC. So AP CERT also established a credentialing system that was modeled explicitly on the European Trusted Introducer service, but it was different because, as the people who were creating this service recognized, the Asia Pacific region is unique for its wide economical gap and complicated security policy gap. So another way of saying that is that many parts of Asia are much poorer than, say, Japan. And security policies vary quite a bit across different parts of Asia. So, for example, they didn't all want to pay into the service. They had to find a way to make it free for everybody, which there was actually a charge for participating in the Trusted Introducer in Europe. So unlike Task Force CSIRT in Europe, which abandoned operational incident response, AP CERT was actually much more active operationally, in part because of substantial language differences. So they would actually help coordinate incident response, partly by overcoming language differences and having a center that would help them coordinate across those. Okay, so while TFC CERT and AP CERT, this one thing, I apologize for this, there's way too many acronyms in this presentation, but it comes with the territory. So while the European CSIRT group and the Asia Pacific group both helped to broker relationships between established teams and new teams. In the 1990s, actually exchanging any information about incidents could be very slow and time-consuming. This was partly because there was no standardized way of describing incidents. Multiple teams could report on the same problems without knowing that they were actually talking about the same thing. It was also because of the need for trust between teams sharing information. So you want to make sure that you're talking to your colleagues and not to a hacker. And so you don't want to just push this out on the World Wide Web when you have information about a vulnerability or an attack. And so the slowness of information exchange was a big problem, right, at a time when attacks move very quickly around the world. So in 2000, leaders in the European incident response community organized a working group to develop a standard, what they called the Incident Object Data Exchange Format, IODEF, and an associated application that would automatically exchange information about incidents. And initially, this work was supported by Turina. And to gain Turina's support, this is a regional organization, they advanced a somewhat parochial argument. They said that the, quote, successful implementation of the IODEF would contribute to Turina and TFC CERT recognition in Europe and worldwide, They also said this project was, quote, a first Europe initiative in an area where all previous attempts have been US-based. So in order to gain the support of this regional organization, they're kind of pitching it as a uniquely European infrastructure. But by 2002, the standard development process actually ended up being moved entirely to the International Engineering or Internet Engineering Task Force. The Europeans had actually worked with IETF from the very beginning because they wanted to be able to use the standard globally. But more importantly, by 2002, Terina felt like it was consuming too many resources and it wasn't primarily a European initiative anymore, so they withdrew their support. Now, while moving standard development to the Internet Engineering Task Force was good from the perspective of creating something that was truly global and not just about Europe, it also complicated the final standard and made it all too flexible. So it might seem strange to talk about flexibility. What that means is if you had different groups using the same standard in different ways, they actually can't communicate because they're not implementing it in the same ways. And this flexibility, as one termed it, was basically a result of more stakeholders from around the world becoming involved. And each one of them wanted, oh, we want this feature, well, we want this feature. And they just added it all in, sort of the kitchen sink approach. And one incident responder notes that IODEF had, this is a quote from an interview, IODEF has so many possibilities and options that I could define my mother-in-law using IODEF. And that was the sense of many people who were involved with that project. So while flexibility might sound good, what it meant was that the organizations sharing data had to agree on how to use it. And that was one reason that the Europeans grew disillusioned with IODEF by the time it was published as an internet standard in December 2007. Additionally, China and Japan both needed to develop language extensions. So despite being a global standard, in practice, many different implementations of this standard entered into use, and each was shaped by the needs of specific partners in incident response coordination. So today, incident response data sharing and exchange continues to be a relatively slow process, even though a lot of standards and tools have been developed. It tends to be continues to be based primarily on trusted relationships between partners. Okay, so I will conclude briefly so we can get to discussion. Basically, I've argued that while efforts to develop a global infrastructure for incident response were developed by a transnational community, the reliance of that community on regional institutions coupled with regionally specific needs ultimately fragmented that infrastructure and limited the scope of transnational cooperation on cybersecurity. And that is all I will present for now. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you. Let me exit this and stop sharing my screen. How do I do that easily? Okay. Oh, I guess I did. I stopped it. Okay. By closing the window.
All right, great. Thanks, Rebecca. Very interesting. Yeah, we definitely have some questions that came up along the way. One thing that I might want to throw out there at the beginning is so I can understand how a standard would help facilitate the exchange of information, but how did different teams see the standard as helping to facilitate trust? I guess some of it is maybe knowing what some of the micro things, because I can imagine, yeah, I know that person, I can exchange information with them, I could ask them some questions or something and they can assure me that it's really who I think it is. But how does a standard, or how do they imagine a standard facilitating trust where that you don't have a relationship there?
Right, I misspoke if I suggested that they did expect the standard to facilitate trust. I think part of what I'm wanting to argue in the paper is that a standard by itself is never enough. What you actually have to end up trusting is the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is continually maintained and managed by people. So if you don't trust the people managing the infrastructure, you don't use it, right? If you think that your local city is maintaining a bridge and you think it might collapse, you're not going to drive over it anymore. So that trust is actually more the prerequisite to using it, not the result of it. I guess you could say that in the case of the trusted introducer, if you think of that as a kind of infrastructure, that kind of service that is provided, that is something that is supposed to help facilitate trust, but even that only goes so far. So one of the interviews I did was with we interviewed both of the people who sort of started that service and who continue to run it. And one of them, said, you don't automatically trust everybody just because they've been vetted. You trust them only so far as you can throw them. Mm-hmm. Even after they have been vetted by that service. But any trust that you invest in somebody who's been vetted by the service, it's really about you trusting the service, right?
Right.
In the infrastructure, before you come to trust the people who've been vetted by it.
So is that sort of the infrastructure beginning to work and do what it's intended is what help builds that trust, right? Like, we trust bridges because they don't regularly fall down. So we trust the people that are in maintaining it. So that's a similar thing. If they can get the system to work, then they themselves, the organization, becomes trustworthy.
Right. Like if you haven't had any problem with information sharing across this organization, the trusted teams within Trusted Introducer, and they do, they have a list of their teams and when they were last certified, and they have to sort of go through it again every year. They check them out again to make sure they're doing things a certain way. So yeah, once you've developed a trust in that infrastructure, such as it is, it might be hard to imagine as an infrastructure, but it really is, because you have something that is routinely being maintained and managed, and that enables this kind of flow of information back and forth. You have to come to trust that it has done its job, right? Because you haven't had problems with people who've been vetted or teams that have been vetted.
Right. Okay. That seems almost like a chicken and egg thing, because, in order for these groups to work, there has to be some trust, but you build trust by things working.
Right. And so it started small, right? At the beginning, Trusted Introducer, they basically said, okay, we will let in all of these teams that we've been talking to for the last 5 years. And we actually meet with them in person. So this is another thing I don't think I mentioned in the talk, but that comes out in the paper, is that the geography really matters. So people in Europe get to know each other because they can just hop on a plane and 2 hours away, they're across the border in another country, and they're meeting face to face, and they get a sense that they know who they're talking to. And it's just hard to do that when you're trying to build relationships from Japan or China to the US. It's a much longer flight. Not going to have those kinds of meetings as often. First does have an annual meeting every year, and it really does go all over the world. Kuala Lumpur, Edinburgh, everywhere. Although it took a while to get to Asia. But yeah, so that regional basis and those face-to-face communications and relationship building were really necessary in order to get the infrastructure going in the first place.
Right.
So you come to, why did anybody trust Trusted Introducer? Because they all knew the two guys who were running it. And it was like two guys who said, we're going to pitch this, we're going to get funding for it, and you all know us, and guess what? We'll vet everybody for you, so you can know that if we vetted them, they're okay. It'll be interesting to see what happens when those guys retire.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It hasn't gotten to that point yet, but I imagine in the next 10 to 15 years, they're probably going to want to retire.
Cool. Yeah, this is really interesting. The more we dig into it, I don't want to dominate. So, other questions? I know Taffeta had one. She put in the chat.
Right. Yeah, I was wanting to know in a really concrete way how the commercial teams got involved. So I picture like IBM, because I have a friend who worked at IBM actually. They have their own clients, and then there's some breach of those clients, and so they really want to repair that. And they might have conflicts of interest. At some point there are lawyers that get involved too, right? And so you sort of, if you could just kind of fill me in on how the government and the commercial fit together, that would be interesting.
That's a great question that I'm still puzzling over. What I can say is that when it started getting really commercial, there was a lot of uneasiness within FIRST. There were people who pointed to exactly those problems. They said, what are we going to do with conflict of interest? Do we really trust, Apple to share information with Microsoft? Or are they going to, which is the basis for the cooperation, is you have to share this information. And it really changed its character. So the CSERTs or the certs from these private sector organizations are very different than the ones for the academic organizations. They're really serving as the incident response for a product, and they basically offer that service to everybody who has bought the product and usually the general public. So Microsoft, for example, has a security response center, and Apple has a similar one. And their constituencies and the ways that they interact with those constituencies is very different than, the way your university cert, and there are still university certs would respond, where they're primarily dealing with people on a campus using university-owned equipment, for example, and on the university network. Microsoft is responding to anybody who's ever bought a Microsoft product that might we suddenly discovered a vulnerability. So they have very different relationships. They absolutely, and I think all certs actually realized fairly early that they needed to have a relationship with legal. They needed to have a legal dimension and understand how to interact with law enforcement. So, there becomes questions where, what if you know somebody, in order to develop trust, right, you need to promise a certain amount of anonymity. So Bank of America might not want to disclose to the public that they've had a breach, right? But their incident response team might need to coordinate with law enforcement. So there's a whole bunch of questions about how they handle these kinds of breaches and how they work with law enforcement. And then finally, I think where it gets most maybe interesting and complicated is at the governmental level. So most governments today also have certs that are not either private or nonprofit. So US CERT is an organization. And if it finds out about a vulnerability, it needs to disclose that to the public as quickly as possible. But some of those vulnerabilities may be things that the National Security Agency wants to exploit, right? And so in general, the government certs, at least in the United States, try to be very clear that they are not cooperating with the NSA. So if somebody sends them a vulnerability, they publish it. And if the NSA was using that vulnerability and now it's gone, they're SOL. That's just the way it goes. That's not the case in all countries. So there's some evidence that China's CERT is very closely aligned with its intelligence organization, the equivalent of NSA. And there was a report recently, for example, that showed that China's vulnerability database, which it's generally faster at maintaining its national vulnerability database than the US counterpart is able to maintain and get vulnerabilities into the database. But there is evidence that with certain vulnerabilities, the intelligence service was actually checking to see if they could use them before publishing them online, and then they would backdate there was a report on this by, I could find it, I think it might be Finite State. It's one of these private companies that looked, and they looked at 2 different points in time and realized the dates had been changing, that they'd said they'd released it earlier than they had previously said they released it. And they realized that what was going on was that for certain vulnerabilities that the Chinese government might want to use, they would keep them to themselves. Now, the National Security Agency does that. The National Security Agency is, at least in theory, in no way connected to computer emergency response team. So I think I've wandered a long way from the private sector question, but it's a great question. And, what is Microsoft has a good relationship with NSA insofar as when a bunch of NSA's exploits got published online, NSA quickly went to Microsoft and said, guess what? We developed this exploit based on your vulnerability. You probably should fix it really soon. And they did. It still got exploited by people who didn't patch their systems. That was Eternal Blue, which led to WannaCry and NotPetya.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that it's also always in flux. So it's like the, host and parasite kind of competitions, where the NSA maybe expects that eventually all of their secrets will be lost because they'll need different secrets by that point anyway, right? So it's kind of like, I
think you're right.
Fascinating and really disturbing that they have so much power that they could exploit, like even over Congress or something. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I don't understand how they are controlled, really, ultimately, the NSA.
Oh, NSA? Yeah, I think that's an ongoing concern of whether there's sufficient oversight. I mean, in theory, there is. I would say I trust NSA more than I trust the Chinese intelligence agency, but that doesn't mean I trust them a lot.
That's a question.
I was wondering, Taylor, if we could kind of circle back to expanding on one of the questions you had, talking about these questions of trust. First, I want to say, by the way, excellent talk. I really like the way you kind of foregrounded the interpersonal relationships and kind of old version social networks that served as the kind of foundation of a lot of this infrastructure. And it actually had me thinking a lot too about the ways trust plays similar roles in the other side of that, right? In hacker communities and things like that. But my question was actually, it circles back to your description of the Morris work, right? And that quote you had that said I think it was the Old Boys Club worked. I think this is interesting because it does serve as a really excellent starting point for showing how things got built. But I think it also indicates to some degree one of the potential problems of a kind of interpersonal as opposed to infrastructural definition of trust, in that it seems that if it's always these networks of trust are built by somebody who knows somebody, that to some degree could perpetuate a sort of insular nature to these communities. And one of the conversations we've had here in a lot of these talks is how do you build communities of practice that can bring new people in, generate new perspectives, and thus by extension enhance and enrich the things you can watch out for in terms of cybersecurity. So I mean, to kind of sum that up, then wouldn't these ways of establishing trust perpetuate old boys clubs and make it difficult to get new perspectives in?
Yes. So this is really, I'll comment specifically on the gender question, actually. This is really interesting. So this is actually a space where women ended up taking a lot of leadership, despite the fact that, computer science by the 1980s was male dominated, not entirely, but it had shifted from the beginning when actually women were major leaders in the field. And then once it professionalized, the women got pushed out. Not all, but a lot of them. This was such a new area of work. The first cert at Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon, the CERT Coordinating Center, they started with one manager and like a handful of employees. And the employees' main job was actually initially, they didn't even necessarily know anything about computer security or know a lot about computer security. They just took notes and forwarded it to one of the experts in the Old Boys Network. Mm-hmm. But then slowly they started to learn more about what was going on. I mean, somebody who was a secretary initially started saying, well, how can I help? And I said, well, when somebody calls, can you sort of take notes on what's wrong and then pass it along? She's like, yeah, I can do that. And then she started picking up more and more what was happening, and she became a leader. She was doing training all around the world on how to run certs. And a lot of those certs, actually, a lot of the work of computer emergency response teams was managerial and sort of about coordinating and building relationships so that it wasn't necessarily primarily technical. And so that also opened up the space to new people getting in. But you absolutely had to develop those relationships, right? Before you would start to trust those people. So in a strange way, I think it both is insular and not, right? In that as a new field of work, a whole bunch of new people came in and actually established a niche for themselves. But then of course, once they really get established, it's harder for new people to come in and get known. I mean, eventually what happens is really you trust in the organization more than the individuals, right? So you know that the US CERT or the CERT Coordinating Center has a particular reputation. And so somebody who's employed at that center, even if you've never met them before, if you can verify, oh yeah, you actually are working for that organization, you're probably gonna trust them. But that's sort of a trust in an institution more than a trust in a person. I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, I think it's a really good point, and it's one that they continue to struggle with because they sort of recognize that we need to develop new networks, but trust only scales so far, Once you're at a conference with 1,000 people, it's not all your best friends anymore. It's your best friends and 999, 900 other people, right? 950 other people.
Yeah, and it seems like a really interesting challenge. Can you institutionally define trust? If maybe you trust an institution, but can you set up ways to vet or even conceive of defining, well, how would you bring a new organization and a new person in when all of that groundwork for the history of, again, old version social networks, right, is so interpersonally focused, and while that presents a certain intuitive way to establish trust, we also know that that's a double-edged sword, and that it comes with its own problems. Ones that you certainly identify too, even just whoever it's easier to fly a plane to meet, you're more likely, or someone you can run into, you're more likely to trust.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I just thought of something that I wanted to just mention briefly on the legal side of things, and it relates to the question of vetting. This is very recent. So before my paper was published, last fall, it wasn't scheduled to be published until July 2020. And I think October of 2019, the current executive director of FIRST emailed me and said, we're actually having trouble with the US government's new rules, and we would like to use your paper to show them that actually what we're doing is very international in nature and it's important, and can we use your paper to do that? So we ended up actually publishing it sooner and doing a preprint and a whole bunch of stuff, and I sort of revised an excerpt. But one of the issues, I later went back and very recently I've been looking at what happened. One of the things that happened was that due to basically a trade war on certain companies in China, like Huawei, FIRST had to basically exclude Huawei's product cert from their membership, as well as the membership of two other organizations, because of rules around exports. And their lawyers advised them first that some of the mailing lists that FIRST circulates, which Huawei and these other companies would have access to, some of the information on those lists could be deemed an export, and that FIRST would then be in violation of rules prohibiting the export of certain kinds of technologies. So information is technology in this legal reasoning, to these companies. And so if you go online, you'll actually see that they have a note very explicitly saying this team has been suspended. It's because of legal changes. And they're trying to say it's not because we don't like them. It's not because we don't trust them. It's because we're not allowed to share information with them anymore, right? So that also sort of gets in the question of how governments can influence the ways in which teams are vetted and represented. Now, does that influence other teams' willingness to trust these teams beyond what they might already have had? I don't know. I think most teams, this is another thing. So I asked some of the European teams, for example, like, do you really trust the Russians, sir? Do you really trust? But basically, from their perspective, at least early on, a lot of the cert in Russia was basically like the techie guys at the Russian universities, right? And so most of us are academics. I think we're all academics. I wouldn't say like, oh, no way do I trust my colleagues at, this university in Russia. I'd say, well, no, we're all academics, we're all intellectuals. And it's sort of a similar relationship where that trust extended across borders, but then governments take actions which can complicate that.
Right. And I think it's interesting too, just when you mentioned that, thinking about those things that do and don't cross borders in terms of establishing trust, right? What are the things that people on that interpersonal level find in common that become those interpersonal foundations of trust?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good point.
Yeah. The connection to academic networks is an interesting one, right? That can be an end.
It really did start kind of as an academic thing, because it was an academic network at the beginning, right? The internet was just how you exchanged files with your computer science friends in other countries, and so then, it was natural the computer scientists that were maintaining this thing would trust each other. But it's changed a lot since then, with And I mean, I didn't say this, but the Defense Department has a cert, right, to defend DoD networks, and I'm sure that the militaries of every other organization. And by the way, I checked, the DoD cert is not a member of FIRST. Not sure whether that's a big deal or not, but it's interesting, right? Because it was initially like that first list of FIRST members. Initially, it was like Army, Navy, Air Force, that sort of thing. So it's changed.
Yeah, I have one thing that makes me think about is I'm always thinking big picture, and I feel like this issue of trust. You're really talking about trust and knowledge, and of course, there's a lot of talk and worry about that today. And I think it's really interesting to think about this idea of scaling. And I mean, do you have thoughts about this as you're watching like mask protests and things like that? Like, do you see is there like of course that's not, you haven't researched that, so I'm just saying, do you feel like there's some sort of connection there that you see based on your experience researching CERN?
Yeah, I mean, these are the more fundamental questions that we're dealing with every day, right? Do we trust Facebook as an infrastructure? Do we trust Twitter as an infrastructure, right? Especially knowing what we do now about like botnets and, and trolls and the ways that people are being manipulated. What does it mean to trust that infrastructure? Do we trust the people on it? I don't know if I have an intelligent conversation and comment on that, but I mean, it's very clear that trust is fundamental to the ways in which we use these technologies. We trust them, but maybe only so far. Then we find out information, then we start going, I don't want to use Facebook because I actually don't know if that news feed has been manipulated by, some operation in another country.
It almost seems like there's the opportunity there for that being taken advantage of, because the news feed might feel local, right? It could feel like it's your interpersonal trust network, right? If that's so huge, but it's really not, right? It's been shaped to appear that way.
Right. And that's sort of how Facebook has tried to respond to all of these concerns about manipulation. It's like, oh, no, we just want everybody to get along. So we'll create a bunch of echo chambers where all the white nationalists, they have their own echo chamber, and the lefties, they have their own echo chamber, and everybody's happy in their deluded little manipulated world. I don't use Facebook a lot. You might be able to.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's because like, how do we know what reality we're getting? But in the arena of incident response, I mean, people were hip to this right at the beginning because they know what's at stake, right?
Right.
Ostensibly is just for fun, and then, oh, by the way, you can use it to try to push people to vote this way or that way.
Right.
With people in incident response, they knew from the very beginning, like, I'm dealing with information that hackers want to get to in order to attack people. And so they're even more sort of guarded than I think we are. Even after everything we know, I think they're more guarded in the ways that they share information and the kinds of information they share than the everyday person might be with their Twitter feed or Facebook.
Yeah, right. All right. Do we have I guess we're coming up on the hour. Is there any last questions?
I haven't been monitoring chat, but I see Yulia has this really interesting comment about centralized governments in place of localized rule. That is interesting. Yeah. Maybe I need to read more medieval history. That's great.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks again for the talk, Rebecca.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was fun chatting with you all.
Yeah. I'm definitely going to take a look at your paper. I didn't have a chance to read it carefully.
It's okay.
Thank you.
It's okay. Yeah. Well, thank you all. I'll be interested to see how your initiative works with your cybersecurity initiative, where it goes. So keep me posted.
Will do.
Okay. Great. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.